Well, welcome everyone, and thank you very much for making time during your lunch hour to join us. Today we will talk about the important distinction between protecting lands and waters and how to do so, and also conservation of lands and waters. We will also touch upon two important current examples, which will then be explored more in depth in upcoming webinars. All three of us here, four, are members of the Biodiversity and Natural Places group of the Sierra Club Maryland chapter. And I'd like to start with presentations. We have Martin Schroeder. He is an executive committee member of the Sierra Club's Anne Arundel group in Maryland. He chairs the local transportation committee and the state chapter nominating committee. Martin is a former research engineer in wind energy with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and is currently a consulting engineer for the development of zero emissions passenger trains. Also with us here as a presenter is Judy Fulton. She is the founder of EcoPlant Consulting and president of the Maryland Native Plant Society and a member of the board of Mid-Atlantic Invasive Plant Council. She helped write and pass the 2023 Maryland Native Plants Program and the 2024 Maryland Invasive Plant Bill. In addition, she has co-authored the widely recognized Plant Invaders of Mid-Atlantic Natural Areas Field Guide and the prize-winning Maryland Native Plant Guide Piedmont Region. And in addition, we have Marie Laporte here, who is the group leader for the Biodiversity and Natural Places group. And my name is Sonia Demery. I am an at-large member of the Maryland Sierra Club Executive Committee, but most will know me better as the Executive Director of the Climate Communications Coalition. We're active regionally and nationally, working to advance environmental health and climate justice through education, advocacy, and legislation, oftentimes alongside the Sierra Club. Our contact information will also be on the very last slide, so you can feel free to contact us if you have any specific questions on our presentations afterwards. So let's discuss conservation versus protection of lands and waters. Let's start first of all with a reminder of why protecting lands and waters is absolutely key. So the current global situation, as you, I'm sure, are aware, is pretty dire. We have seen a 73% decline of monitored species since 1970. This means we are only 2 percentage points away from a mass extinction. This biodiversity collapse is due to the loss of habitat and overexploitation. And biodiversity is absolutely key and vital for humans, be it for pollination, food security, soil formation, and so many other things. An issue has been that we are encroaching upon biodiversity. There's only 5% of Earth's surface left untouched. In addition to threatening biodiversity, this lack of untouched surfaces interrupts Earth system processes. These are not often talked about, but they're absolutely vital. They are the water cycles, the small and large water cycle, the carbon cycle, biogeochemical cycling, etc., and the disruption of these cycles. What we see is the climate change. I wanted to point out, and I hope you can see my pointer here, on each slide I have embedded the digital object identifiers. So if you want to dig a little bit deeper into any of the signs that I am mentioning here, you can just click on it and it will take you to the article. These are peer-reviewed, science-based articles. So right now I'm showing here on the right side a graphic produced by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And we are looking at total millions of tons of wet biomass of mammals. In other words, this is all the mammals on the planet. And as you can see here, humans, between ourselves and our animals, be they cattle or pets, take up 94% of all the mass right now, with only 6% left for wild marine and wild terrestrial animals. So this means we're taking up all the natural resources as well that we should be sharing. So to quote Dr. Edward Osborne Wilson, have we no shame? We should be sharing far better than this. The science is absolutely clear as to what we need to do. First of all, we need to retain and protect existing ecosystems. In doing this, we need to focus on forests and streams. Intact forests host 80% of terrestrial biodiversity, and they provide enormous amounts of ecosystem services that we all rely on for life. On the other hand, streams are natural wildlife corridors and ecosystem connectors. In addition to retaining and protecting existing ecosystems, we need to restore 30% of converted land. If we do so, we would pretty much mitigate the entire mass extinction that we're seeing. And we can also mitigate 50% of all the greenhouse gases, that, especially CO2, that we have pumped into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. So this is our silver bullet. This is really where we need to be. Knowing this, in 2022, 196 countries agreed to permanently protect 30% of lands and waters by 2030. And this is what we know as 30 by 30. Yes, absolutely. We also need to eliminate emissions and reach a circular economy. However, drawing down carbon and other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere is going to take a long time. In addition, in 1997, 30 years ago, the Kyoto Protocol at the IPCC focused on market-based mechanisms such as carbon credits, offsets, mitigation bank credits, etc., which have become more often than not a greenwashing scheme. The fact, how we know that this is a fact, is that emissions are continuing to rise year over year. They don't work. So let's focus on protecting lands and waters. There's a lot of guidance on protecting this. The Sierra Club itself has a conservation program which calls for the protection of 30%. I want to draw attention to the use of conservation versus protection. And that's why we're here. There is a big confusion about those two terms. There are existing protection campaigns for the Arctic, Pacific Northwest, California, and Yellowstone, but there don't appear to be any major campaigns east of the Mississippi. So we can remediate that. It also works with the Sierra Club's intergenerational equity policy, meaning that we are keeping ecosystems, nature, natural areas alive for future generations. There's enormous amount of international guidance by the United Nations, educational, social, cultural organization, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, and the Global Biodiversity Framework. In the United States Geological Survey has been designated the official monitor and the official tally for our progress on 30 by 30. To do so, the USGS created a guideline based on GAP codes, and GAP stands for Gap Analysis Project, funny enough. They could have just kept it at GAP. And really what we're analyzing is the gap on we need to close to reach the protected lands 30 by 30. So there are 4 different types of management styles in these GAP codes. In GAP 1 means it is land is protected from conversion, it will never be developed. And there is really no management. We're trying to maintain the natural state. So this would be untrammeled wilderness. In Maryland, it is counted such as wildlands type 1 is what we're calling it. For example, the Yougaheny Wild River would be one of these. GAP 2 is permanent protection from conversion and management. However, there is some management to avoid too much degradation, be it by climate change or invasive species. However, here too, there is no extraction, meaning no logging, no agriculture, no fishing, and there's no traffic on or off roads. An example of this could be the Chesapeake Forests land, which currently are undergoing some adaptation measures because of sea level rise. GAP 3 lands are also protected from development and conversion, but they are subject to extractive uses. So we have agricultural reserve, forestry, mining, fishing, and there is on and off-road traffic to work these lands. We call these working lands or lands in conservation. So you see how, and then there's GAP 4, which is basically not zoned or doesn't have any mandate for management. So only GAP 1 and GAP 2 count as land protection. Only those without extractive management, without chemicals, chemical applications, without traffic, help biodiversity and earth system processes to rebalance. So how is Maryland doing on our 30 by 30 goals? Well, according to the United States Geological Survey, Maryland has protected 2.67% of lands. So this is not much, and this is somewhat potentially somewhat outdated, but it shouldn't be too much outdated. This was updated earlier this year. The Maryland dashboard, in turn, tells us we have 33.3% of lands protected. In fact, in 2024, Governor Moore came out and said we had reached 30 by 30, and we're now going to 40 by 40. So how is this discrepancy possible? Well, Maryland is including lands in conservation, or GAP 3 lands, working lands, into what is protected lands. So working lands, as I mentioned, are not paved over, but they are actively managed, be it for agriculture, be it for logging, for mining. They can be farmed, sprayed, burned, logged, thinned, mined, fished, etc., on or off traffic. The important to take away here, the most important message is we absolutely need the lands in conservation. We need our ag reserve, we need some tree farms, we need fisheries, but we also need protected lands, and we're lagging behind big time with 2.67% of protected lands only in Maryland. Underneath here is a list of what is included and what Maryland DNR is including in the protected lands category. And as you can see, most of them should not be there. So lands in conservation are working lands. These are all GAP 3 lands. You can see here how there's been some extraction, known as logging, on the top left picture. This is actually part of a mitigation bank project. The Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, the CREP program, to maintain agriculture is absolutely key, but it doesn't help biodiversity or natural places. It doesn't help ecosystem processes to develop naturally, specifically, as you see, because of chemicals and constant management, really. And these parks are obviously also important, but they are not helping biodiversity to recover. So the key here is that public lands belong to the people. And where we need to go is we need to educate the public and legislators on the difference between protection, which is GAP 1 and GAP 2, and conservation, GAP 3, working lands. To do so, we want to engage the public and really clarify, because the public and most legislators and most people in general would think that conservation is equal to protection. It is very different. And then we can advocate to move GAP 3 and GAP 4 lands into GAP 1 and GAP 2 styles management. These are administrative procedures, and we should be able to initiate that change through local and state advocacy. So how about our forests? Well, our forests are getting an especially raw deal, honestly. Forests in conservation are not considered to be in conservation unless they have a management or a stewardship plan. All management stewardship plans require some sort of active management. In other words, it doesn't mean protecting the forests. A forest in conservation can be logged if we afforest the same size or larger area somewhere else on the same spot. We call that the no net loss policy. The problem with that is that we are equating mature forest ecosystems with newly afforested fields of seedlings when they provide very, very different levels of ecosystem services. Unfortunately, also with the market-based mechanisms, the carbon credits, offsets, etc., we have promoted the replacement of mature forest ecosystems with new plantings. So the policy of no net forest loss is enshrined in the Forest Conservation Act, and it is very unfortunate that many big greens also follow this misguided policy, knowing far better, but it's profitable. So we need to, as we saw on the other slide, protect existing Maryland forest ecosystems and add another 30% in land protections. In Maryland, 73% of forests are privately owned, and according to the Maryland Forestry Economic Adjustment Strategy, they are mostly kept for nature and beauty. They could even be GAP 4. They're literally just not, they don't have a management plan attached. So let's start by protecting them. It is also important that we protect our eastern forests. It is absolutely key because in global climate models, eastern forests survive past 2100. Very unfortunately and sadly, the projections for boreal, western US forests and tropical forests is to succumb to stand replacing events by the end of the century. So we need to protect our existing forests to provide the ecosystem services that may be lost with other forests. In addition, we need to especially protect existing forest ecosystems because mature and old growth provides the most complex structure and supports the most biodiversity. If you look at this little picture here, you see all the different layers of habitats, which really only a full mature forest, intact forest, can offer. Currently, we just are in the process of submitting Greenwich State Forest commentary against their logging plans for 150 acres of mature forests, calling 100 to 118-year-old oaks mature or over mature is really it's not based in reality. In addition, we're working against a Swallow Falls Bridge replacement on a different location, which would impact old growth hemlock grove, 300-year-old trees. There are two options being floated. We are going for option 1C because it would not impact the little bit of old growth that we have in Maryland. If we were to go with the option provided by, supported by the DNR, we would lose over 1.7 acres of mature forest and remove up to 13 old growth, over 300-year-old trees. They will not come back. It is unfortunate also that the DNR's legislative exceptions to, say, the Swallow Falls Bridge, the Yuck River, to protect wildlands and wild rivers really undermines these protections. Legislative exceptions shouldn't be allowed once we have protected lands. And instead of no net forest loss, we should look at gross forest cover only. It is a much better indicator since forest cover gain is much slower than loss. You can imagine a forest that has grown over 100 years can be logged in less than a week. So no net loss allows for the simplification and gradation of complex ecosystems as well, which we do not want. The forestry industry has been very good at positioning itself as the only industry that can actually maintain capable forests for the provision of ecosystems and to help with climate change. This is untrue, clearly. The science is very clear that the most carbon is sequestered in forests that are unmanaged. As you see here, the red line, you see far more carbon is accumulating than in any of the other types of management styles. In addition, intact forests provide the most ecosystem services and biodiversity support. Ecosystem services such as oxygen production, water filtration, soil generation, green water and evapotranspiration, which is basically the biotic pump and avoiding vapor deficit, erosion control, storm buffering, temperature regulation, invasives control, flood reduction, you name it. Intact, mature, and old growth forests are what we need to protect. And we need to let mature forests grow old and ancient so that they can continue to support biodiversity and provide all of these ecosystem services. Here's a couple of examples. This is a mature forest on Maryland's eastern shore, and this is what it looks like after it's been managed. And then here to the right, we see how two types of lands in conservation. One looks a bit more like a tree farm because it's mostly pine, and an ag farm are being basically the forest is being converted to agriculture. So there's conservation is somewhat of a mixed bag at times when we are encroaching upon protected lands. Another big issue has been the stream restoration projects. These are actively managed and for mitigation credits and carbon credits. They have become a very lucrative business. We shouldn't be looking at managing or restoring or reshaping discrete segments of streams. We should be looking at the whole watershed, and really where we can have an impact is at the runoff source by improving riparian buffers. These type of projects are usually a washout and require a re-restoration for many $1 million, again, afterwards, a couple of years later. So how do we go about expanding land protections in Maryland? Well, first off, it has to be a very long-term coordinated effort, but we can start looking at what the Maryland Department of Natural Resources has already zoned as somewhat precious. So, for example, we have a natural areas map with 32 isolated spots. You can see those on the map. However, these spots are managed to maintain the ecosystem static. They should be left to evolve naturally. There's also a list of 362 irreplaceable natural areas, but there are meetings for the management plans and objectives of each of these areas rather than the protection of these areas. And then the wildlands, which is really our only wildlands type 1 Maryland style, our only GAP 1 type of land. All that is currently under threat from transmission lines as well. Again, we had a legislative exception, which has been problematic. The best point to start might be the Habitat Connectivity Network. It includes 2.2 million acres in hubs and roughly 250 acres of corridors for about 38% of Maryland's land. So this is fantastic. This is all in conservation, but we should have a look and see what GAP 3 and 4 lands can be moved into GAP 1 and 2 management styles to create protected reserves or hubs without management, without extraction, and without traffic. As I mentioned before, this would be an administrative procedure on local and state level and should be responsive to local and state advocacy and holding our leadership accountable. There is some interesting guidance on how we can create these reserves or hubs. This is again based on UNESCO, and they have a program called Man and Biosphere. Within it, they show the zonation process. It basically comes to protecting the existing ecosystem, as we said earlier. There may be a little bit of restoration work, but once it's restored, it should be pretty much hands-off. Around it, we create a buffer, which could be from, for example, converted agricultural land or restored agricultural land, especially cash crops, which have a very bad effect on our environment. This buffer zone can then be expanded, rewilded according to the International Union of Conservation for Nature guidelines. The identification of these spots really should be on a local basis, like, for example, Sierra Club local groups. Like, what areas do you know in your county, for example, need to be protected? Then we expand this area, and around the nucleus, we have a transition zone where only compatible activities are allowed to take place. So, for example, agriculture, but without using chemicals. So it would be regenerative agroforestry farming, solar panels, bees, etc. Once we have identified these reserves or hubs, we connect them. And this has to be, it's absolutely key that it happen with a science guided by science. Really what we're going to try to do is include public lands and volunteered private lands. There are some examples, such as the Scientific Advisory Council in Massachusetts or Indiana, the Natural Resources Foundation. They guide where the nuclei should be positioned, how they can be expanded, and how they can be connected. Importantly, it will be very important that we avoid corporate and industry interests in this so that we actually focus on biodiversity and ecosystem processes. Scientific guidance is also absolutely key because of our bioregion shifts with climate change, which have already, we're seeing a biota shift. So, for example, we know that the blue crabs are moving towards Boston, and if the Boston lobster is moving towards Canada, this is all happening with all of biodiversity, not just with shellfish. So we have trees propulsing themselves further north. We have all sorts of different species. So is this a climate-driven shift or is it an invasive species? So these are things that only scientists can really define. Also, they are the ones in charge of figuring out the different timeframe projections. Are we looking at 100 years, 300 years, 500 years? And also seeing if any assisted migration should happen, then only it should happen by experts. Nobody should try to undertake that by themselves. But yeah, so you see the UNESCO way of zonation is very close to what the Department of Natural Resources is trying to do. So the plan is to, first of all, identify and restore ecosystems. This is bottom-up organizing, such as we are doing at the Biodiversity and Natural Places campaigns, with the Biodiversity and Natural Places campaigns. Importantly, in this, we respect all members and communities' unique interests and priorities. We are applying the Sierra Club Jamboree principles. And second, we create a scientific body to connect these reserves or hubs at a state and local levels. And this would be top down. Sierra Club is aiming to introduce legislation in 2027 for the creation of such a scientific body. We think there are several opportunities for us right now. One, the generalized resistance to federal and state environmental malfeasance. Second, the public and legislators already think that conservation means protection. It would be simpler to have one overarching campaign that covers streams, forests, vernal pools, biodiversity, native plants, you name it. There would be cost savings from less land and waters management for the DNR. Finally, timber is mainly sourced from private tree farms and really should be exclusively so. There's 110,000 acres of tree farms in Maryland. And because the public forests and parks belong to all Marylanders who need them for their physical and mental health and for biodiversity and ecosystem service provision. It is key that we act now and put this system in place because we're getting paved over pretty quickly. Development is accelerating. So additional supporting steps, we are doing this educational campaign right now for the public, media, and legislators to make sure that everybody understands the difference between conservation, working lands, GAP 3 lands, versus protection, which is for biodiversity and ecosystem services, which would be GAP 1 and GAP 2. We're trying to put into place a system now for hubs, reserves, and corridors in order to protect them. Also, it will require a very long-term education and professional training because this is all about future generations having all the ecosystem services they need as well. So this is place-based participatory engagement and education. And then we are seeking to develop a program for volunteer private lands and waters and to move these from protection, move these into protection status from conservation. This can be through donations, voluntary participation, or purchase, outright purchase as well. Some purchases can be done through redirecting harmful state and federal subsidies, such as logging, biomass, fossil fuels, ethanol, corn, soy, beef, etc., to fund the permanent protections and land acquisitions. Oregon even added a 1% tourist tax. So finally, in your Maryland County, what lands and waters could permanently be protected? Can you think about 5 natural places that you really love, that you enjoy? Second, do you own land? And if so, would you put it into permanent protection? What would it take to put it into permanent protection? Because we're seeking to develop a permanent protection option for private land. So we're looking for input on that. Clearly, it would be helpful, the larger size of lots and a location closer to natural areas, but frankly, it's not necessary. Everyone can participate in the restoration or rewilding and protection of natural areas. And everybody can do their little step, even if you have a flower pot with pollinated plants, even that helps. We need to support biodiversity. So if you would like to obtain support and permanent protections for your favorite natural areas, please join the Biodiversity Natural Places group of the Sierra Club Maryland chapter. And then second, please be on the lookout for 2027 legislative updates and calls to action. And then here's the website for the Climate Communications Coalition, has 2 tabs, 30 by 30 and Down to Earth, which provide additional information. All righty. Well, I hope all of this gave you some food for thought. I know this was a lot of information. I'm sure that Martin Schroeder's insights into urban forests and their importance as GAP 2 lands will also be eye-opening. So, Martin, take it away, please.
Thank you, Sonia. As a follow-on webinar to this one, and as part of a series on forest preservation, we'll explore the urban forest and its role in creating livable cities. Now, I'll take just a few minutes now to provide a preview of the topics we'll be discussing. Certainly, the first thing is what's an urban forest? So we'll discuss what that means, what people call urban forests that really aren't, why they're important, an example of urban forests both in the US and worldwide. There is a lot of effort worldwide to look at urban forest integration into cities. What are town centers and transit-oriented developments? We'll explain that and how it relates to urban forest. The challenges to protecting urban forests, some examples there, and solutions for approaches and examples there as well. So one example we'll talk about is the urban forest in Odenton, which is shown here. It's 15 acres of natural forest area in the middle of a planned town center. And just to orient you a little bit here, on the very right, you can see there's a road that is Piney Orchard Parkway. Along the top of this is Annapolis Road. And to the left of it is the railroad tracks, and the station is just to the left of the tracks down by the bottom part of the circle. So it's centrally located. It's easy walking distance for those in the town center living there in apartments or in homes around the area. The site has a lot of trees of various sizes and types and with wetland and streams. It's a perfect location for an urban forest. It is publicly owned and it conforms as of now GAP 1 and GAP 2. So what are the challenges that we're facing with preserving urban forests? First, there's a lot of intense competition for space and amenities due to increased urbanization. People want everything. Lack of education and awareness about urban forests. People may not really understand what they are and what the benefits of urban forests are. Also, I think people look at maybe an area that has trees on it, and they first think of cutting it down and putting something there, whether it be, recreational facilities, which are important, but other things, if it's a larger area, just logging for the benefit of making money from logging. So just not recognizing the benefits of urban forests. And also, I think a general comment about the environment. It's kind of lost in the news today. We have so many things taking up bandwidth, dealing with wars, dealing with the price of gas, housing shortages, things of that nature, that the environment sort of gets pushed to the side. And finally, a challenge of being better advocacy for forests. I think that's where we need to go and put some emphasis on that.
Thank you, Martin, for elevating the importance of urban forests. And now let's go to Judy Fulton, who will be highlighting another legislative exception, this one through Wildlands Type 1. Take it away, Judy. Thank you.
This is another example, again, just a taste of an issue that the Maryland Sierra Club is dealing with. There are problems with how transmission lines are being put through or proposed to be put through the state. And MARL is a good example of that in Western Maryland. PJM Interconnection is the regional manager of our electric grid, and it has been looking at reliability and saw the need to increase regional electric capacity. For MARL, it selected routing from Pennsylvania to Virginia through Allegheny and Garrett counties in Western Maryland and through West Virginia. Through a bidding process, it chose NextEra Energy to build the transmission line. NextEra Energy originally looked at 6 routes as alternatives and convinced the Maryland Assembly last year to pass a law that would allow a transmission line through the wildlands. This law does have some safeguards like There's an existing transmission line through Maryland wildlands that was there before the wildlands were created, and the idea is to parallel that existing line. After eliminating 4 of the routes as alternatives, NextEra asked that DNR do assessments of 2 routes to determine the environmental impacts. And in mid-2025, DNR got back saying that avoiding the wildlands was the best of the 2 options. However, NextEra chose the alternative running right through the wildlands, irreplaceable natural areas, and old-growth forests. As Sonia has said, this is called Type 1 wildlands, but it also falls under the category of Gap 1. In other words, the forest would be undisturbed in a wildland, in a Maryland wildland. There would be recreational opportunities like hiking, but no active management. NextEra filed for approval of the construction and of this particular route with the Maryland Public Service Commission just this January. Next. To summarize what DNR's many concerns included, they were worried about harming rare, threatened, and endangered plant and animal species in their habitats. Major concern is introducing invasive plants, both with the work and then by opening up the area, and increasing predator access to FIDS, forest, interior dwelling species like ground nesting birds, through fragmenting a pretty pristine natural area and creating more edge habitat, and also degrading water quality. These are just 4 examples. There are more. Now, I want to make it clear that the Sierra Club Maryland chapter opposes the route, not the actual transmission line. So what we're doing at this point is we're looking at using existing rights of way, avoiding the wildlands by changing to DNR's preferred route, and maybe a combination of those 2, plus as a more minor but still important addition, making sure that the new ROW is converted to native meadow habitat, and over the long term invasives are controlled. We're taking a close look at this very complicated issue, and we expect to file comments with the Public Service Commission on June 1st. So again, this is an example. We need to have a lot of preserved land, and this is an opportunity for us to step up and make sure or encourage at this point that land be preserved, not just conserved. Thank you, Sonia.
Thank you. So here is our contact information. As I mentioned, you will receive the slides and this entire recording, so you can look back at it. And you can also go to the resources and click on the different links and explore a little bit. So thank you very much. We hope you learned something, and we hope that you might be interested in joining us in the Biodiversity Natural Places group.
Just wanted to mention, since you mentioned joining the Biodiversity Natural Places team, for anybody who is interested, the Sierra Club Maryland calendar has our meetings posted. We meet on Fridays at 1 o'clock. We usually have about an hour and a half long meeting. So anybody who's interested in joining, we welcome you to join. It's an open meeting. So you can either register there or you can email me. My name is Marie Laporte at verizon.net.